When the Pharisees, with some scribes, who had come from Jerusalem, gathered around Jesus, they observed that some of his disciples ate their meals with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. For the Pharisees, in fact all Jews, do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders. And on coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed. The purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and the scribes questioned him. Why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands? He responded, well did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrine human precepts. You disregard God's commandment, but cling to human tradition. He summoned the crowd again and said to them, hear me, all of you, and understand, nothing that enters one from the outside can defile that person. But the things that come out from within are what defile. From within people, from their hearts, come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within, and they defile. The gospel of the Lord. Well, today we are celebrating the 22nd Sunday of Ordinary Time and kind of getting back into the ordinary swing of the Gospels. You know, we just come off of this huge masterpiece called the Bread of Life Discourse. In the last 4 weeks, we've been in John, because, of course, the Bread of Life Discourse is only in John. But now we're going back to Mark. So to get into the Marconian flow of things, let's just kind of catch up where we left off. Do you remember now Jesus had gone home to his own hometown, Nazareth, and it didn't work out so well, right? They had rejected him. Then he had the sending out of the 12. They had great success. They came back. He said, come away to a faraway place, and so that you can rest. And of course, no rest for the weary. They have the feeding of the 5,000, one of the greatest miracles in all of Scripture. Then we had the walking on the water. Then we had the healing of Jairus' daughter. And then, of course, the hemorrhaging woman was in the middle of that healing. I say all of that to say this. Jesus has stirred up a tremendous amount of interest. And he has a whole lot of crowd following him. Now, most of this crowd were poor and disenfranchised people. Most of this crowd were peasants and farmers. But there were some others we can assume in that crowd. Possibly some Roman soldiers that were keeping an eye just to make sure there wasn't an insurrection. Possibly some upper class people that were just curious, wanted to hear what this itinerant and wandering preacher from Nazareth was doing. But we know for a fact that there were temple officials that were in that crowd, keeping an eye on him. Now, this happens in Gennesaret, which is a long hoof from Jerusalem. So these people have come a tremendous way to follow Jesus. And isn't it interesting what they focus on? Now, we don't know for sure if the Pharisees or the scribes had been there for the feeding of the 5,000. We don't know for sure whether they were in the crowd for the healing of the temple official's daughter or the hemorrhaging woman. We don't know. But we certainly know they must have at least heard about it. But instead of focusing on these tremendous miracles, instead of addressing him as rabbi or teacher, or any kind of respect, what do? They ask him a question. A gotcha question. You know, those kind of questions. Questions that are not really interested in an answer. Questions like, you know, Piers Morgan on CNN, you know, when he's interviewing, so he always interrupts the people he's interviewing. You can tell he's not really interested in an answer. He's interested in that gotcha moment. You know what I'm saying? And I don't want to just pick on him, but bring back Larry King. He was much more of a softball thrower. But anyway, they look at him and they say, why is it that your disciples don't observe the ceremonial washing before they eat. Now understand this, just a little bit about ceremonial washing. This was not of the Mosaic law. This was one of the many, many laws that were added by the elders through the centuries. And it wasn't about hygiene, it was about spiritual cleanliness. Understand that a Jew couldn't even eat with a Gentile, couldn't even sit at the same table without being defiled. And it's not like they were sharing the same bowl or something. It isn't a hygiene issue, it's a spiritual thing. You see, Pharisee, the very word means to set one apart, right? Also understand that in the ancient world, we take water for granted here in West Virginia because we got it. It's very plentiful. And it's free for me because I'm tapped into the hotel water, but for most people it's pretty cheap, right? All we have to do is just turn on the water. In fact, many of us, we go buy water because we want the bottled water. Water is very plentiful, but in the ancient world, particularly this part of the ancient world, it was very hard. It was a commodity. It's very scarce. It's very precious. So the time and the effort and the expense to wash regularly with water was really kind of reserved for the upper class, the elite, the religious leaders. Again, it's a separation, which is one of the things that just drove Jesus crazy. So they go, why is it that your disciples not observe the ceremonial washing? And Jesus is not going to take this. And like I said last week, he's not one for much for small talk. He goes right at him and he says, well, did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites? Let me just make sure I got it just right. It says, well, did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrine human precepts. In other words, you're far from God as you cling to your tradition. You're all about the tradition and you're not about the message. And it's very easy for us, 2,000 years later, to look back and go, yeah, those dirty little Pharisees, they didn't know what was going on, right? Well, let's look at ourselves, Because when you point a finger, remember you got 3 more coming back at you, okay? It is true. Isn't it true? And I'm guilty too. Oftentimes we cling to our traditions, so much so that we miss the message. I remember when I first got here a couple of years ago, and I walked into this church for the first time, and I went, well, there sure is a whole lot of work we got to do in here now, isn't there? And we cleaned Joseph, and we cleaned Mary, and we repainted Jesus, and we cleaned these walls, and it was really dark up here, so we put this track of lighting up here to make sure this was going on, and then we cleaned the stations, and then we put all these roses outside to make it really pretty, and we spent a lot of work and a lot of time fixing this place up, but it won't mean anything if nobody came. Right? It doesn't mean a thing. I mean, evidently, somebody in the 70s decided, hey, I got a great idea. Let's glue this Spanish marble and cover it with green carpet. That's a great idea, isn't it? Unfortunately, it happened throughout the state, in many churches. So we're trying to polish that. We got rid of the green carpet there. We're working on this next. We're going to open up the sanctuary. We're going to make this really nice. We're going to restore the tradition of the church, right? But if nobody comes, what difference does it make? In the same way, at the table of the Lord, when we celebrate the Eucharist, which is, way important, right? When we take Jesus into our bodies as a part of our Mass, if we walk out of here with, fighting each other in the parking lot on the way out, if we're checked into the Mars Hotel while we're in the middle of Mass thinking about, well, what are we going to do after this? Are we going to go to dinner? Or are we going to watch a football game? Or what? If we're not present, then it doesn't mean anything. It's very easy for us to get caught up in the traditions and lose the message. There's a fable that's told of a spring that springs up, this magical spring. And it sprung up from the ground, and people started discovering that the spring had healing powers. And people came from far and wide to drink of this spring and to bathe into the spring. But you know how it is, after a while, wealthy people, they bought the land for that spring. They put a fence around that spring. They started charging admission for that spring. They built up hotels and casinos real near it. And a whole industry started to form around that spring. And after a while, that spring became the property of the elite and the privileged. And the spring got mad. And the spring stopped flowing and went and sprang up somewhere else. But a funny thing happened. The people that had built up so much around that spring were so drunk in their power, so lost in their tradition, they didn't even notice that the spring had stopped flowing. And that is how it often can be with our faith. We can get so caught up in doing just the right thing, genuflecting just the right way, coming to Mass, doing all the right things, and then walk out the door and then live our life, that it just doesn't matter whether the spring is flowing or not. If someone were to examine your life over the last week, if somebody was to hire a private detective and follow you around and write down everything that you said and everything you did, could you be accused of being a Christian? That's really what this is all about. Jesus is not condemning tradition. Tradition is a beautiful thing. It's handed on by our elders. It's the way that we express ourselves. But if we get so lost in the tradition, then we get lost in the grave. Are you lost in the grave? Let our prayer today be that our focus will be not on our traditions, as beautiful as they are, but on the message. The message that Jesus is trying to communicate with you and I today, which is let us pour ourselves out as a libation of service and love to our fellow people and live the Christian life. Let us keep our ears open so that the Holy Spirit can prompt us not only daily but hourly of what exactly it means to be a human being. And then we will truly learn the lesson of this gospel.